December 17, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. Hansfeld, a small Belgian village, lay silent beneath a blanket of frost. The sky was a dull iron gray, heavy with low clouds. In the half-light of dawn, a Tiger I tank rolled forward along the frozen road until its Maybach engine coughed once, sputtered, and died. Inside, Unterscharführer Weber twisted the ignition again and again, his gloved hands slick with sweat despite the biting cold. The massive engine gave nothing but silence. "Reserve tank is also dry, Herr Obersturmbannführer," Weber called nervously from his compartment. His words cut through the chill air like a verdict. From the turret, Joachim Peiper slammed the steel hatch with his fist, the clang echoing across the still countryside. Then he climbed down, boots crunching in the frozen mud. The commander of one of the most powerful Kampfgruppen in the Ardennes offensive now stood beside his immobile tank, staring out into the dim mist. Around him, 67 tanks, nearly 150 half-tracks, and over 5,000 Waffen-SS soldiers had ground to a halt. The greatest armored thrust of Germany's last gamble sat paralyzed, not by American artillery, but by empty fuel tanks. Ahead, Hansfeld appeared ghostly and abandoned. American troops from the 99th Infantry Division had retreated in haste only hours before. Fires still smoldered in oil drums beside the road. A few tin mugs of coffee cooled on wooden tables. It looked as if men had simply vanished mid-breakfast. But what drew Piper's eye wasn't the abandoned village. Beyond the buildings, in a wide clearing, lay row upon row of jerry cans, thousands of them stacked in pyramids, their olive-drab paint catching the dim light. Hauptsturmführer Hans Grühle pried one open and inhaled. He looked at Piper, his expression somewhere between relief and disbelief. Benzene, high-octane gasoline. Piper walked among the stacks, slowly, almost reverently. He counted quickly, his mind racing with figures. 50,000 gallons, enough to keep his column moving for days, enough perhaps to reach the Meuse River itself, enough to change the shape of the offensive. For his men, who had rationed every liter for months, it was like a gift from the gods of war. And yet, as Piper stood in that clearing, another realization pressed down on him. If the Americans could abandon such vast amounts without hesitation, if they could leave behind what Germany would have guarded with whole divisions, then perhaps this war was already lost. Only 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, had delivered a report that spelled doom. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the fragile lifeline of the Wehrmacht, had been shredded by Allied bombing. The Leuna plant, once producing 175,000 tons in a month, barely managed 5,000 by September. Hydrogenation plants at Politz, Blechhammer, Bruchsal, and others were running at less than 10% of capacity. The numbers told the truth plainly. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, counting every synthetic drop and the Romanian fields, produced just 33 million, less than 2% of American output. The Reich was trying to fight mechanized war on the scale of a continent, while its armies increasingly relied on horse-drawn wagons. Meanwhile, America drowned its soldiers in petroleum abundance. Major Friedrich Zimmermann of the Wehrmacht's logistics staff had calculated grimly. To reach Antwerp, the Ardennes offensive would require at least 4.5 million gallons. Hitler had allocated 5 million. In practice, only half was delivered because of transport problems, fuel shortages, and Allied bombing. The entire plan depended not on stockpiles, but on capturing American supplies along the way. What looked like ambition was in truth desperation written into orders. The Americans fought by an entirely different logic. Across France, they had built a pipeline network known as Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean, which pumped gasoline directly from Britain into Normandy and beyond. They had organized the Red Ball Express, a non-stop convoy of thousands of trucks running day and night. delivering 12,500 tons of supplies daily. By December 1944, U.S. forces in Europe consumed 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and received 1.4 million. They were not burning through reserves, they were building them. Piper, though only 29 years old, was no amateur. He had fought on the Eastern Front, won the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and seen firsthand that fuel, more than ammunition, determined the rhythm of modern war. His Kampfgruppe was the designated Schwerpunkt, the spearhead meant to break open the Ardennes. Yet he had arrived at Tondorf 2 days before the offensive to hear General Sepp Dietrich's blunt warning. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies. Piper's unit had been allocated just 31,000 gallons. Enough, perhaps, for 50 miles of combat. The Meuse lay 65 miles away. The math was damning. On December 16th, the German artillery barrage thundered across the Ardennes. More shells fell in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. Behind that barrage, Piper's tanks began to roll. Maps had shown highways. In reality, they found narrow country lanes and frozen ruts. Vehicles jammed, engines idled, precious fuel was burned for no progress. At Lanzarote, the first real objective, they ran into resistance from a single American reconnaissance platoon, just 18 men. Yet those 18 men, dug in on the ridge, delayed Germany's most powerful armored column for nearly 10 hours. Tanks sat idling, exhaust fumes mingling with mist, gallons disappearing into the air. By the time Piper broke through and rolled into Hoensfeld the next morning, his column had advanced 20 miles and burned 40% of its precious allocation. The depot at Hoensfeld was no major installation. It was a forward supply point, a temporary Class 3B depot for the 99th Infantry Division. Yet what Piper found there exceeded the monthly allotment of an entire German Panzer division. Jerry cans stacked 3 meters high, stretching 200 meters across, high-octane aviation and motor gasoline, 80 octane or higher. For American machines, it was ordinary. For German engines, it was almost too pure, causing mechanical problems for some tanks designed for lower grades. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, once a clerk in his father's import business, discovered shipping manifests in the depot office. He could read English. The papers traced the gasoline's journey from Texas oil fields to New York harbors, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, over the Channel to Normandy, then 400 miles by truck to Belgium, all in 6 weeks. Hoffmann brought the documents to Piper. The SS commander read them twice, crushed them in his fist and said nothing. His face had gone pale. Both men understood. Their enemy could move fuel halfway around the globe faster than Germany could move it across a single front. Among the papers lay newspapers too. Stars and Stripes, dated December 15th, only 2 days old. The headline declared a new pipeline opened from Cherbourg to Verdun, pumping 300,000 gallons daily. A single line delivering in 1 day what his entire Kampfgruppe would need for the whole offensive. For Piper, the message was cruelly clear. Germany rationed liters like jewels. Civilians had long since abandoned private cars. Farmers yoked horses to plows again. Black market sales of single liters were investigated by the Gestapo. Even the Luftwaffe was collapsing. Pilots trained for only 60 hours instead of 250. Yet across the Atlantic, America commanded oil fields larger than all of occupied Europe combined. Refineries ran so efficiently that companies experimented with byproducts simply because they had too much crude. In that moment, standing among 50,000 gallons of captured gasoline, Piper's men cheered. They believed they had been saved. But their commanders sensed the deeper truth. The capture was not salvation. It was revelation. The column moved again, engines roaring to life as fuel from captured American cans coursed through their tanks. Soldiers who had resigned themselves to halting now felt hope stir. The jerry cans were passed, hand to hand, poured into steel throats of tigers, panthers, and half-tracks. For a moment, The sound of Maybach engines drowned out the silence of defeat. But the mood of triumph was fragile. Officers knew the truth. 50,000 gallons seemed immense, but Piper's spearhead alone could devour that in less than 3 days of hard combat. Tiger I tanks consumed 2.5 gallons for every mile traveled in battle conditions. Panthers, the backbone of the armored force, burned 1.5 gallons per mile. Even lighter vehicles demanded their share. Every hill, every detour, every idle moment chipped away at the miracle they had just seized. Still, soldiers allowed themselves to believe. To men who had marched across the Eastern Front, to those who had learned to fear the lifeless stillness of stalled engines, the smell of gasoline was intoxicating. Private Ernst Koller remembered the cheer that rippled down the column as the first tanks refueled. It was like the sound of victory itself. Engines turning, exhaust clouding the air, the feeling we were unstoppable again. Yet Piper walked among the stacks with a different face. He kept glancing at the Stars and Stripes newspapers they had found. A headline celebrating a single pipeline capable of delivering 300,000 gallons daily. His men saw salvation. He saw futility. That one pipeline, invisible under Allied-controlled soil, could have replaced his entire miracle every sunrise. Fuel was not just about movement. It was about strategy. 6 months earlier, in June, Speer's report had explained how Allied bombers had strangled German synthetic production. Leuna, the largest plant, had been bombed again and again, its towering hydrogenation units reduced to twisted steel. At Blechhammer, fires burned so long that locals nicknamed the glow the second sun. By September, production across all facilities had fallen to 1/10 of capacity. American oil, by contrast, gushed endlessly. The East Texas field alone produced more than all of German-occupied Europe combined. In 1944, the United States pumped 1.8 billion barrels. Germany's 33 million? Barely registered. These were not abstract numbers. They translated into Sherman tanks moving without pause, convoys of trucks streaming across France, bombers flying with full tanks and long escorts. Major Zimmermann had warned that Hitler's plan for the Ardennes depended entirely on capturing fuel. Without it, not even the most heroic advance could succeed. The allocation for Kampfgruppe Piper, 31,000 gallons, was barely enough for 50 miles. The Meuse lay 65 away. From the beginning, the mathematics whispered failure. Still, the operation began with spectacle. On December 16th, German guns thundered. Shells rained on American positions, more fired in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had sometimes managed for entire campaigns. It looked impressive, yet behind the curtain lay critical shortages. Fuel tankers had been hidden in forests, their loads rationed with painful care. Vehicles were ordered to move in single file to save gasoline, and engines were to be switched off during halts longer than 5 minutes. Piper issued orders himself. The capture of American fuel depots was to take priority over tactical objectives. If fuel was found, everything else could wait. Soldiers understood. They joked bitterly that they were not fighting for Berlin or Antwerp. They were fighting for jerry cans. The contrast with the enemy could not have been sharper. On the same morning that Piper's tanks rolled out, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion scribbled in his diary, "Received fuel resupply. 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks already full." To German eyes, such words would have been unthinkable. As the offensive struggled forward, the geography of the Ardennes added cruelty. Maps had promised broad highways. Instead, Panzers crawled along twisting, narrow farm roads, engines groaning as steel tracks tore through frozen mud. Half-tracks bogged down. Heavy tank destroyers scraped against stone walls, and as hours passed, their engines idled. Fuel burned away with no progress. Then came Lanzarote. Just 18 American reconnaissance soldiers dug in on a wooded ridge. They faced nearly 5,000 Germans with tanks and artillery. For almost 10 hours, they held their ground, sniping, moving between foxholes, making every shot count. Piper's column, snarled behind them, wasted thousands of gallons in the waiting. By the time the Germans finally broke through and entered Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, they had covered just 20 miles. In doing so, they had already consumed 40% of their supply. In 2 days, they were running on fumes. And then, in that small Belgian village, fate handed them the depot. The contrast was almost grotesque. The Germans had measured their hope in single digits of thousands of gallons. The Americans had left 50,000 behind without hesitation. Fires in barrels, coffee still steaming, pyramids of gasoline untouched. Evidence of an enemy so confident in its resources that it did not even bother to destroy what it left behind. Hauptsturmführer Hans Grulle later testified after the war, "We found jerry cans stacked 3 meters high. They stretched for hundreds of meters. None had been touched. The Americans had not even attempted to set them alight." The irony was biting. The fuel was so pure, 80 octane and higher, that German tanks sometimes sputtered on it. Engines built for lower-grade fuel coughed and backfired, mechanics scratching their heads. American abundance had produced gasoline of such quality that it was almost too good for German machines. Even so, every drop was precious. Soldiers formed chains, carrying cans to waiting vehicles. Officers shouted orders above the roar of engines. The column surged back to life, metal giants crawling forward once more. Sergeant Hoffman leafed through the shipping manifests in the depot office, tracing the fuel's path. Oil pumped from Texas, tankers carrying it to New York, convoys across the Atlantic to Liverpool, ships unloading into England, barges across the Channel to Normandy, then trucks rolling 400 miles into Belgium. 6 weeks from well to front line. Hoffman remembered showing the papers to Piper. The commander read them in silence, then crumpled the sheets. His face betrayed what he would not say aloud. This enemy could summon oil across oceans faster than Germany could move it from its own heartland. And so, on the morning of December 17th, 1944, Kampfgruppe Piper stood in the middle of a paradox. They had been saved, for the moment. Yet the very scale of their salvation revealed the futility of their mission. As the men of Kampfgruppe Piper fueled their machines from the American stockpiles, the paradox of the moment grew sharper. Soldiers cheered, officers shouted, engines roared, yet the deeper truth gnawed at those who understood numbers. This was not victory, it was reprieve. Piper himself walked the depot in silence. He watched as jerry cans were carried in chains, as tigers and panthers rumbled back to life. But in his mind, he kept seeing those stars and stripes headlines. One pipeline, delivering more in a single day than his entire force would consume in the whole offensive. A single pipe versus an entire army. It was not a comparison, it was a sentence. The Ardennes offensive had been designed as a gamble. Hitler believed that by striking through the forest, seizing Antwerp, and splitting the Allied front, Germany could force a negotiated peace. But the plan depended on speed, surprise, and above all, fuel. Without gasoline, tanks were steel coffins. Piper knew it. His men knew it. Even Sepp Dietrich, who had given the order, had admitted it aloud. The operation was built not on strength, but on the desperate hope of stealing what the enemy had in endless supply. American abundance was already visible everywhere. At Normandy, in the summer, U.S. engineers had constructed Pluto, undersea pipelines feeding gasoline across the Channel. From there, convoys of the Red Ball Express had driven day and night, trucks painted with red circles streaming down highways marked exclusively for supply. In 3 months, they had carried over 400,000 tons to the front. Each truck consumed 40 gallons daily, meaning the supply system itself devoured more fuel than entire German armies received. Yet the Americans had so much they could afford it. For the German soldier, it was different. Civilians back home had not seen cars on roads in years. Farmers harnessed horses to plows again. Children watched carts instead of trucks. The Gestapo investigated theft of a single liter. Soldiers received rations so tight they sometimes used captured Soviet fuel, cut with alcohol, destroying engines after weeks. Training for pilots had shrunk from 250 hours to 60. Crews for U-boats drilled in classrooms rather than at sea. Gasoline had become rarer than gold. Now, in Hunsfeld, there was enough fuel in sight to power the Reich's dreams, and enough to expose their hopelessness. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman, leafing through the Stars and Stripes, remembered later, "I showed Piper the headline about the Verdun pipeline. He read it twice. Then he crushed the paper in his fist. He did not say a word, but I saw the color drain from his face. In that silence, I knew what he was thinking. If they can pour 300,000 gallons a day through a pipe, how can we ever win?" Private Ernst Koller found humor in the absurdity. He wrote in his diary that night, "They left coffee on the tables, newspapers on the desks, and mountains of gasoline stacked like bricks. We fought for weeks for single barrels, and they forgot 50,000. We thought ourselves wolves, and they were elephants who left crumbs larger than our meals." The gasoline was poured into German machines, but it carried something more dangerous than liquid fuel. It carried knowledge. Every can that sloshed into a Tiger's tank reminded its crew that the Americans had oceans of it waiting just behind the line. Every sip of stolen abundance proved that Germany's miracle was America's routine. And so the column rolled forward again, into the Belgian winter, engines hungry, treads grinding ice and soil. The offensive still had momentum. Piper's Kampfgruppe was still the sharp edge of Hitler's last great gamble. But in that moment at Hunsfeld, beneath the pale dawn sky, something irreversible had been revealed. The war was no longer decided by daring thrusts, by elite divisions, by courage or discipline. It was decided by wells in Texas, by refineries in Louisiana, by convoys across the Atlantic, by pipelines snaking beneath the soil of France. It was decided by factories that produced more oil in a week than Germany in a year. The miracle at Hunsfeld had not saved Kampfgruppe Piper. It had unmasked the truth. Evening of December 17, 1944. Engines of Piper's Spearhead roared again, exhaust fumes rising like breath in the freezing air. The men had siphoned the American miracle into their tanks, and for a brief moment it seemed as though destiny had shifted. Tigers and Panthers once more shook the ground. Half-tracks rattled along frozen lanes, and boots marched with renewed confidence. Yet behind the noise lingered the same shadow. How long would the fuel last? Officers ran the numbers in notebooks. 50,000 gallons for a column of over 600 vehicles. Tigers at 2.5 gallons per mile, Panthers at 1.5. Half-tracks devouring their own share, plus trucks, artillery tractors, supply wagons. At best, 3 days of movement. At worst, 2. The miracle was already being spent as soon as it was celebrated. Still, morale surged. Private Ernst Koller described the mood in a letter years later. When the engines turned over again, we felt unstoppable. It was as though we had stolen time itself, stolen days from fate. But ahead of them lay Billingen, and beyond it, Stavelot. At Billingen, they struck quickly, overrunning scattered American detachments. They captured more rations, maps, and ammunition. But the most important find was information. Among the seized papers, German officers discovered records pointing to other depots scattered across the region. The Americans, it became clear, had fuel everywhere. What the Germans saw as miraculous bounty was, for the U.S. Army, simply routine distribution. As Piper's column advanced toward Stavelot, rumors raced ahead of them. This depot, intelligence reported, contained more than 2 million gallons. A fortune beyond imagination, enough to power his Kampfgruppe not just to the Meuse, but perhaps even further. Soldiers whispered about it. picturing pyramids of cans larger than anything at Honsfeld. Mechanics calculated how many miles it would carry them. Commanders considered how it might finally allow the breakthrough. But the Americans were already waiting. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received urgent orders from 1st Army Headquarters: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. There was no ambiguity. The depot at Stavelot was to be destroyed if Germans approached. The depot sprawled across 15 acres. Stacks of jerry cans piled 3 meters high, stretching row after row like walls of steel and fuel. The winter frost glittered on their surfaces as Brewster's men ran trails of gasoline between the stacks. White phosphorus grenades were distributed among squads. They prepared in silence, knowing what it meant: the destruction of more fuel than they themselves would see in years of service. At 16:30, as the first German advance guards crept toward the outskirts of Stavelot, Brewster gave the order. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis hurled the first grenade. It burst with a flash, igniting the gasoline trails. Within seconds, the entire depot became a wall of fire. Flames soared 100 feet into the sky. Cans exploded like artillery shells, sending roaring waves of heat across the snow. Black smoke rose in a column 1,000 feet high, visible for miles in every direction. The inferno would burn for 3 days. 2 million gallons of precious gasoline were gone in a single act of denial. Untersturmbannführer Weber, Piper's driver, later recalled watching the scene. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his turret. He said nothing for minutes. When he climbed down, he said only, "They can afford to burn it. What are we doing here?" The realization cut deep. For Germans who guarded every liter, who measured hope by jerry can, to see Americans incinerate oceans of fuel was more than a tactical blow. It was psychological annihilation. And Stavelot was only the beginning. Across the Ardennes, American engineers carried out the same orders. At Trois Ponts, another 1.1 million gallons went up in flames. At Spa, 2.5 million. In the first week alone, over 8 million gallons were deliberately destroyed by U.S. troops. More fuel than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive was simply erased, sacrificed without hesitation. To Piper's men, the message was unmistakable. They were fighting an enemy who could treat in abundance what Germany worshipped in scarcity. The fire at Stavelot glowed like a beacon across the Ardennes. German soldiers could see the column of smoke rising thousands of feet into the air. Some thought it was an oil refinery, others a burning city. Only later did they understand. It was millions of gallons of gasoline, deliberately sacrificed by an enemy so rich in supply that it could set rivers of fuel ablaze, rather than let Germans touch a drop. In diaries written later, German officers described the silence among Piper's men as the news spread. They had marched to Stavelot dreaming of salvation. Instead, they saw flames that mocked them. Private Ernst Koller later told an interviewer, "We celebrated at Honsfeld like we had won the lottery. At Stavelot, we realized the lottery was theirs, not ours. They burned more in 1 hour than we had captured in a week." By December 18th, the numbers painted a grim picture. In just 2 days of combat, Piper's column had consumed roughly 67,000 gallons. They had captured perhaps 55,000 in total. Already they were in deficit. Every new mile forward pushed them closer to disaster. The arithmetic was cruel. Tigers burning 2.5 gallons per mile, Panthers consuming 1.5, half-tracks and supply vehicles taking their share. And now, after delays at Lanzarote, roads clogged with mud and snow, and engines idling for hours, consumption was even higher than predicted. Fuel poured away into exhaust instead of distance. Meanwhile, The Americans did not merely hold their own supplies, they increased them. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for 1st Army, recorded in his log for December 18. Fuel receipts yesterday, 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 1,623,000. Net gain to reserves, 224,000. While Germans risked everything for cans, the Americans added hundreds of thousands of gallons to storage, even while engaged in battle. And above the ground, pipelines worked with mechanical regularity. Operation Pluto fed 1 million gallons daily from Britain into France. The Cherbourg-Paris line carried 800,000 gallons every 24 hours. The Verdun extension moved 650,000. By December, Allied armies consumed 7.5 million gallons per day and received 8.2 million. They were building reserves while fighting a continental war. For German soldiers trudging through the snow, the scale was incomprehensible. In letters home, some described seeing American convoys where every truck seemed new, engines idling freely, drivers tossing cigarette butts without care. Rumors spread that Americans washed clothes in gasoline or used it to start campfires. Whether true or not, the image wounded morale more than enemy artillery. At Chenot, the Germans captured another small depot, 5,000 gallons. Enough to keep moving for a few hours. It vanished almost immediately into tanks and trucks. Mechanics reported that within 3 hours of combat, the supply was gone. Hauptmann Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, scribbled in his notebook, "By noon, 67,000 gallons consumed since the beginning. Captured perhaps 55,000. We run at deficit. This cannot last." The Americans were well aware of this desperation. Ultra-intercepts of German radio traffic revealed Piper's plight. Orders from General Courtney Hodges were blunt. Enemy critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. That same day, American logistics displayed another feat. C-47 transport planes flew 316 sorties to Bastogne, delivering supplies to the besieged. Included in the drops was 160,000 gallons of gasoline. In one day, for one surrounded garrison, the Americans delivered more fuel by air than Piper's entire force possessed on the ground. By December 19, as Piper's column reached Stummel, the crisis sharpened. Tanks were abandoned not because of enemy fire, but because they were dry. Crews siphoned the last drops into a handful of machines, leaving others behind in the snow. Men looked at powerful steel monsters, engines intact, guns loaded, and knew they were nothing without gasoline. Estimates suggested Piper had perhaps 8,000 gallons left, enough for one engagement or a retreat, but not both. He gathered his officers. Sturmbannführer Werner Puchke, blunt as always, told him, "We have fuel for 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30. Hans Grulle, Piper's adjutant, later testified that the Obersturmbannführer spoke quietly. "Gentlemen, we fight an enemy who burns more to deny us than we receive for an entire operation. What we captured at Honsfeld, which seemed miraculous, is nothing to them. We cannot win." At higher command, others were reaching the same conclusion. General Hasso von Manteuffel, leading 5th Panzer Army, later wrote, "When I learned the Americans destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk us taking it, I knew the offensive had failed before it began." Colonel Friedrich von der Heide, captured on December 23rd, told interrogators with bitter honesty, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men have not seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" The disparity was staggering. On December 21st, Piper's trapped forces had perhaps 1,000 gallons. The American divisions surrounding him, the 31st Infantry, the 82nd Airborne, the 3rd Armored, together received 340,000 gallons that same day. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home with a touch of humor, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes we use more heating coffee than they have for tanks." This was the essence of industrial war. For America, fuel was plentiful enough to joke about. For Germany, fuel was the hinge of survival. By December 20th, the Ardennes gamble was unraveling mile by mile. Piper's Panzers, once the sharp spear point of the German offensive, were bleeding fuel faster than victories could refill their tanks. Abandoned vehicles dotted the roadsides, not wrecked by shells, but deserted for lack of gasoline. Crews siphoned every last drop from broken half-tracks and shattered supply trucks, pouring the liquid into the few Panthers and Tigers still able to crawl forward. That morning, a radio crackled with grim news. Fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. The message fell like a hammer. What little hope remained of reinforcement evaporated in the roar of Allied fighter bombers. Piper called his officers into a farmhouse. Maps spread across the table. The numbers were merciless. Their remaining supply, perhaps 8,000 gallons, would barely move them 20 kilometers. The Meuse River, their critical objective, was still 30 kilometers away. They had advanced 60 miles since the offensive began, but the final stretch was impossible. Grulla, Piper's adjutant, later remembered his commander's words, "Gentlemen, we are fighting an enemy who burns more to deny us than we receive for entire operations. What at Honsfeld seemed like salvation is to them nothing." Meanwhile, American abundance continued to astonish. General Patton's Third Army, executing a rapid pivot north to relieve Bastogne, required 350,000 gallons just for redeployment. To German planners, such numbers would have seemed insane. Yet the Americans delivered it in 3 days, as though it were routine. Even in the skies, disparity reigned. On December 23rd, with clear weather at last, Allied aircraft flew 2,000 sorties. P-47 Thunderbolts consumed 300 gallons an hour. B-26 bombers, nearly 200. In a single day of flying, the Allies burned more fuel than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. The Luftwaffe, crippled by shortages, could only watch. Inside Piper's ranks, morale collapsed. Soldiers whispered about American waste, about convoys of brand-new trucks left idling, about GIs throwing chocolate to dogs. These were not just rumors. They were truths experienced firsthand. Prisoners later told interrogators that waste shocked them more than firepower. One Oberst confessed, "We knew the production figures abstractly, but to see soldiers discard more than we possessed broke our spirit. Every man understood then, the war was hopeless." Fuel shortages poisoned every branch of the German war machine. Ambulances could not evacuate wounded. Field hospitals stood dark for lack of generator fuel. Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting testified later, "We had surgeons, instruments, even supplies captured from Americans. But without gasoline for ambulances, men died waiting for transport. Lives ended not for lack of skill, but for lack of fuel." By December 21, Piper's Kampfgruppe was surrounded at La Glaise. They had perhaps 1,000 gallons among all surviving vehicles. The American divisions encircling them received allocations in the hundreds of thousands each day. The contrast was grotesque. Private First Class Richard McKinney of the 30th Infantry wrote home, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain says we use more fuel for heating coffee than they have left for tanks." On December 23 through 24th, Piper ordered the abandonment of all vehicles. Crews destroyed their own armor, pouring the last fuel into charges to blow turrets and engines. Over 100 tanks and assault guns were left behind, many in perfect condition, except for empty fuel tanks. Men slipped into the night on foot, trudging through the snow toward German lines. Out of more than 5,000 soldiers who had begun the offensive with him, fewer than 800 would return. For German command, the lesson was undeniable. Field Marshal Model, reading reports of captured and destroyed American depots, muttered, "We are not fighting the same war." Hitler, shown photographs of Stavelow's inferno, dismissed them as propaganda. Hollywood effects, he called them. But soldiers at the front no longer believed in illusions. They had seen oceans of fuel denied to them while they begged for drops. The Battle of the Bulge had been conceived as a desperate stroke to split the Allies. Instead, it revealed a truth long hidden behind propaganda. America's industrial and petroleum capacity was beyond German comprehension. The Ardennes offensive consumed 2.8 million gallons of fuel. In the same period, the U.S. Army in Europe consumed 267 million. The disparity was nearly 100 to 1. Germany lost more than tanks and men in those frozen forests. It lost belief. Soldiers wrote home of Americans idling engines, of burning millions of gallons, of convoys stretching farther than the eye could see. Propaganda about soft Americans collapsed in the face of such abundance. When Piper abandoned his tanks at La Glaise, it was more than a tactical retreat. It was the physical symbol of Germany's defeat. The sharpest point of the Reich's last offensive had been blunted not by enemy fire, but by mathematics of production. Industrial war had reached its inevitable conclusion. December 23, 1944. For days, the skies over the Ardennes had been locked under heavy cloud, muffling Allied air power. Now the weather broke. The first rays of sunlight revealed endless contrails scratching the heavens. Within hours, the drone of engines grew into a deafening roar. Allied aircraft filled the air. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, B-26 Marauders. More than 2,000 sorties in a single day. To German soldiers on the ground, it was like watching the very sky turn against them. Bombs pounded crossroads, rockets slashed through columns, 50 caliber bullets tore through thin armor. But the real message was not destruction, it was consumption. Each Thunderbolt burned 300 gallons of fuel per hour. Each Marauder, 200. In one day of flying, the Allies devoured more gasoline than the Wehrmacht had allocated for the entire Ardennes offensive. For Piper, the numbers were now merciless. His Kampfgruppe had advanced 60 miles in 7 days, fighting through ambushes, seizing depots, and leaving trails of burned villages. Yet every step forward had drained fuel faster than he could replace it. Out of 119 tanks and assault guns that had crossed into Belgium with him, fewer than 40 were still mobile, and even those stood on empty tanks, engines cold. That night, he made his decision. His officers assembled in a farmhouse, shivering by candlelight. Maps sprawled across the table, markers showing their isolated position. American divisions pressed from all sides. Fuel remaining, barely enough for a few dozen kilometers. Ammunition low, supplies gone. Piper spoke quietly, almost flatly. "We cannot continue. We must abandon vehicles." The order fell like a funeral bell. For tank crews who had treated their machines like lifelines, it meant leaving behind weapons worth fortunes, machines that symbolized German might. But without fuel, they were no more than steel statues. Crews set to work. They siphoned the last drops into demolition charges, poured gasoline onto engines, placed explosives in turrets. Flames lit the night as one by one the tanks of Kampfgruppe Piper were destroyed by their own men. What German propaganda had once called the invincible armor of the Reich now burned because of empty gauges. Unteroffizier Heinz Goltz remembered it with bitterness. "We drained everything, perhaps 200 gallons total from all vehicles." The Obersturmbannführer himself helped destroy his own command tank. Then we walked away. Millions of Reichsmarks left behind in the snow. Out of more than 5,000 men who had begun the drive with him, fewer than 800 would make it back. The rest were dead, captured, or lost in the Ardennes. News of the disaster spread rapidly. Field Marshal Walter Model received reports on December 26th. He read them twice. 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld. 2 million destroyed at Stavelot. More than 8 million deliberately burned across the Ardennes. He shook his head and muttered, "We are not fighting the same war." Even Hitler was briefed. Shown photographs of the inferno at Stavelot, he refused to believe them. Hollywood effects, he called them, dismissing the evidence as Allied propaganda. But to the men who had marched through fire and snow, there was no doubt. They had seen oceans of fuel wasted by their enemies while they begged for drops. The numbers were staggering. The Ardennes offensive consumed 2.8 million gallons of fuel. In the same period, U.S. forces in Europe burned 267 million. The ratio was nearly 100 to 1. Every German tank crewman who walked away from his machine knew in his bones that the war was lost. The withdrawal from Le Glaise on the night of December 23-24 was a march of ghosts. German soldiers slipped into the dark forests, leaving behind their steel beasts. Tanks that had once shaken the earth now sat silent, frost forming on their armor. Panthers lined up like statues, tigers hulking in the moonlight, half-tracks and artillery pieces scattered across fields, all abandoned, not because they had been destroyed in battle, but because their fuel gauges pointed to zero. For the Americans who entered Le Glaise at dawn, the sight was surreal. They moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, expecting ambushes. Instead, they found dozens of tanks perfectly intact, guns loaded, optics clear, radios still in place. But when engineers climbed inside, they saw the needles fixed at empty. A salvage report filed by Major Robert Harrison noted, 39 tanks operational condition, abandoned solely for lack of gasoline. Estimated requirement, 8,000 gallons to restore. 8,000 gallons. A trivial figure to American supply officers. The Red Ball Express burned more than that in a single hour, just keeping convoys rolling. Yet for Piper's men, those missing gallons were the difference between armored might and humiliating retreat. The disparity was not lost on prisoners. Captured officers spoke frankly under interrogation. Colonel Friedrich von der Heide admitted, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men have not seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" For German morale, the psychological blow was devastating. Soldiers had been told endlessly that Americans were weak, decadent, unprepared for real hardship. But in the Ardennes, they discovered an enemy who not only matched them in courage, but possessed resources beyond comprehension. Letters intercepted by sensors revealed the spreading despair. They use fuel for heating tents. They drive trucks only half-loaded. They fire artillery for Christmas celebrations. To men who rationed every bullet and every drop of fuel, such stories were unbearable. On December 24th, while Piper's exhausted survivors trudged on foot, American forces prepared for the holidays with convoys of supplies. The 82nd Airborne received its daily allocation, hundreds of thousands of gallons, even as it tightened the noose around Piper's remnants. Private First Class Richard McKinney of the 30th Infantry wrote to his family, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. A captain says we spill more fuel cooking coffee than they have left for tanks." It was not just a joke. It was the truth of industrial war. Above them, the skies told the same story. Clear weather allowed Allied aircraft to fly freely. On December 24th, more than 2,000 sorties took off. Each plane drank gasoline by the minute. One day of air operations consumed more fuel than the entire German offensive had been allocated. The Luftwaffe, grounded for lack of aviation fuel, could do nothing but watch the contrails stretch endlessly above. German officers later testified at Nuremberg that this was the moment they understood the war was lost. Field Marshal Keitel confessed, "We had tactical superiority in 1940 and 1941. By 1944, we could not move divisions for lack of fuel, while Americans moved armies like chess pieces." Heinz Guderian echoed him, When Piper captured 50,000 gallons, it meant everything to us. To Americans, it was nothing. That was the end. The numbers reinforced the hopelessness. During December 1944, American forces consumed 267 million gallons in Europe. Germany, for the entire offensive, had planned on 5 million and captured a fraction of that. One side measured in oceans, the other in drops. The abandonment at La Glaise was not just a tactical defeat. It was the physical symbol of Germany's collapse. The Reich's sharpest armored thrust had ended not with destruction by enemy fire, but with soldiers walking away from machines because tanks could no longer drink. The aftermath of Piper's retreat left behind more than wrecked machines. It left behind shattered illusions. German soldiers, trudging back through snow and forest on foot, carried with them the bitter knowledge that they had not been beaten by superior tactics or firepower, but by fuel gauges and arithmetic. For those who reached safety, the stories spread quickly. Letters carried fragments of despair across the Reich. The Americans burn millions of gallons in days. They light whole depots rather than let us touch them. They waste more than we dream of having. One Feldwebel wrote to his wife, "Americans wash clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They drive tanks as we march on foot. This war is lost." Censors tried to intercept such words, but they moved faster than propaganda could silence them. Prisoners of war, questioned by American officers, expressed more shock at Allied abundance than at their firepower. Oberst Gunther Reichhelm told interrogators, "We knew your production numbers abstractly, but seeing soldiers throw away food, discard half-full cans, idle trucks all day, that was worse than your artillery. That was the end of belief." Even high command admitted the same. Field Marshal von Rundstedt privately remarked, "The Americans are fighting another war, one we cannot even imagine. We scrape for liters, while they drown in oceans." By the final week of December, Piper's ordeal had become emblematic of the entire German predicament. On December 27th, Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded in his diary that weather had slowed fuel deliveries to American units to only 500,000 gallons per day. Officers briefly expressed concern until someone noted that this exceeded the entire German allocation for the Ardennes. Concern turned to laughter. Patton's Third Army continued its pivot north, consuming 350,000 gallons just to move into position. For Germans, such figures belonged to fantasy. For Americans, it was an entry in a ledger. The psychological weight of these discoveries lingered far beyond the battle. During the Nuremberg trials, German generals spoke repeatedly of fuel. Keitel, Jodl, Guderian all pointed to gasoline as the decisive factor. "We could maneuver divisions in 1940, Keitel testified. In 1944, we could not maneuver platoons." Joachim Piper himself, years later, gave a bitter reflection to a historian. Speaking of the Honsfeld depot, he said, "Finding that depot was the worst thing. If we had run out earlier, we might have retreated with dignity. Instead, we discovered that Americans had oceans while we had drops. We discovered impossibility." The Ardennes offensive had been conceived as a bold stroke to change the war. Instead, it became the proof that Germany no longer controlled its fate. Industrial warfare was no longer decided by brilliant generals, but by refineries, pipelines, and endless convoys. Historians later calculated that by late 1944, Allied production outstripped the Axis by 5-1 in most categories, and by nearly 50-1 in petroleum. America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone. Germany managed 33 million. Japan, 2.6 million. The Axis combined barely equaled a rounding error in American statistics. For German soldiers who saw American engineers torch millions of gallons without a second thought, these numbers were no longer abstract. They were lived reality. They were written into every abandoned tiger, every blown-up panther, every jerry can poured away into snow. The Battle of the Bulge consumed lives, weapons, and hope. Yet its deepest wound was invisible, the knowledge that the Reich had lost long before its armies stopped moving. When the men of Kampfgruppe Peiper slipped away from La Glaise, leaving behind nearly 300 vehicles in pristine condition, but drained of fuel, they did more than abandon machines. They left behind the last illusion that Germany could match American industry. Empty tanks told the truth. Christmas Eve, 1944. The village of La Glaise lay under a heavy silence, broken only by the crackle of fires and the distant rumble of American artillery. Snow blanketed the fields, glittering in the pale light of a cold moon. The once mighty spearhead of Kampfgruppe Peiper now lay scattered across the countryside like a graveyard of steel. When American infantry cautiously entered the village at dawn, they braced for ambushes. Instead, they stumbled upon a surreal sight. Dozens of German tanks stood intact in fields and along roadsides, their dark hulls frosted white. Tiger I heavies loomed like statues, their thick armor unscarred by shells. Panthers lined up as though waiting for orders. Half-tracks, artillery pieces, and trucks crowded barns and orchards. Every weapon was still functional, every gun loaded. But inside the cockpits, the fuel gauges all told the same story: empty. Major Robert Harrison, assigned to survey the wrecks, filed a report that stunned even experienced logisticians. 39 tanks and assault guns remained in operable condition, abandoned solely for lack of fuel. He estimated that just 8,000 gallons would have restored them to fighting shape. 8,000 gallons. A figure that for the Americans was trivial. The Red Ball Express consumed more than that every hour just to keep its convoys rolling. To Peiper's men, it had been an unreachable dream. For the soldiers of the 30th Infantry Division who walked through this iron graveyard, the disparity was almost beyond comprehension. They joked grimly that the Germans had been beaten not by rifles or artillery, but by arithmetic. Private First Class Richard McKinney later wrote, "We've got Germans who ran out of gas. Our captain said we spill more fuel boiling coffee than they had left for tanks." To German prisoners, however, there was no humor. Many were visibly shaken, some near despair. Interrogators recorded their astonishment not at Allied firepower, but at Allied waste. Colonel Friedrich von der Heide, captured nearby, confessed, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men have not seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" The psychological collapse spread far beyond Peiper's men. Across the front, captured soldiers repeated the same observations. Americans idled trucks all night for warmth. They destroyed depots containing millions of gallons rather than risk their capture. They used fuel with such casualness that it seemed infinite. What German propaganda had painted as a decadent, weak enemy now revealed itself as a giant, so wealthy in resources that it could waste more in a week than Germany produced in a year. Back in Germany, letters from the front carried these revelations, despite censorship. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote home, "Americans wash clothes in gasoline. They fire artillery to celebrate Christmas. We cannot fight infinity." Goebbels' diary on December 28th recorded his growing alarm. Reports indicate serious morale problems. Soldiers write of American superiority in materiel, undermining our narrative. For Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, the lesson was unavoidable. After reading reports of 50,000 gallons seized at Honsfeld, 2 million destroyed at Stavelot, and more than 8 million erased across the Ardennes, he muttered, "We are not fighting the same war." Even Hitler, briefed on the scale of American fuel reserves, refused to accept reality. When shown photographs of the infernos at Stavelot and Trois Ponts, he dismissed them as fabrications, calling them Hollywood tricks. Albert Speer later recalled, Hitler simply refused to believe the numbers. He said they were propaganda. He denied what every soldier had seen with his own eyes. But among the rank and file, illusions were gone. Men who had seen depots burn and tanks abandoned understood that the Reich's fate had already been sealed. What they had witnessed in the Ardennes was not just the failure of an offensive, it was the end of belief that Germany could still win the war. The war had become a contest of production, and in that contest, Germany had already lost. The destruction of Kampfgruppe Peiper's armored column was more than a tactical loss. It was a revelation of scale. The brutal arithmetic of industrial war laid bare in the snow of the Ardennes. In February 1945, Allied intelligence calculated the fuel situation across Europe. The results confirmed what Peiper's men had already learned by bitter experience. American armies in Northwest Europe consumed 7.5 million gallons of fuel per day and received 8.2 million. They were not merely sustaining their forces in battle. They were growing reserves, even while launching offensives. By contrast, the entire German allocation for Operation Wacht am Rhein had been 5 million gallons, barely enough to fuel a single American army group for less than 1 day. The difference was not only in quantity, but in organization. American fuel distribution operated with precision. Convoys of the Red Ball Express carried 412,000 tons of supplies in just 3 months, each truck running 24 hours a day on color-coded routes. Standardized parts, uniform fuel grades, and interchangeable equipment kept the machine running. Even the waste was staggering. The convoy system itself burned more fuel daily than Army Group B received in a month. Yet the Americans had so much that efficiency mattered less than momentum. Germany, by contrast, had become a patchwork of desperation. Tanks built in different factories required different lubricants and oils. Captured Soviet trucks needed spare parts that German depots could not provide. Panthers demanded different fuel than French vehicles pressed into service. The entire force became a logistical nightmare. Each variation multiplied delays, breakdowns, and shortages. American superiority extended into the air. Their refineries had perfected catalytic cracking, producing 100-octane aviation fuel in vast quantities. This gave Allied fighters superior speed and climb rates compared to German aircraft, many of which ran on synthetic blends of only 87 octane. Pilots trained on hundreds of flight hours, while German cadets received barely 60 before being thrown into combat. Even captured American fuel sometimes proved too refined for German engines, which sputtered on gasoline that seemed too good. The consequences reached the home front as well. By 1944, German civilians had not seen private cars for 2 years. Farmers returned to horse-drawn plows. Gasoline was so scarce that the Gestapo investigated black market sales of single liters. Women pushed carts of coal through city streets. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American refineries ran at such capacity that oil companies experimented with new byproducts simply to use their excess crude. For German soldiers who saw this disparity firsthand, the propaganda of Joseph Goebbels collapsed. They had been told the Americans were weak and decadent, incapable of real endurance. But in the Ardennes, they discovered an enemy who could burn millions of gallons in days, who could torch oceans of fuel without hesitation, who could fly thousands of sorties without fear of running dry. The myth of German superiority could not survive the sight of American abundance. At Nuremberg, German leaders consistently returned to this theme. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel admitted, "We had operational superiority in 1940 and 1941. By 1944, we could not move forces for lack of fuel, while Americans moved armies like chess pieces." General Heinz Guderian reflected bitterly, When Piper captured 50,000 gallons, it meant everything to us. To the Americans, it was nothing. That was the moment the war was over. Even the soldiers themselves understood the symbolism. Unteroffizier Karl Wortmann, captured at La Glaise, later stood in front of a Tiger tank preserved in a museum. When asked why such powerful machines had been abandoned, he laughed bitterly. "We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions to keep them from us. How could we fight that?" On the other side, American soldiers often failed to grasp the depth of German desperation. Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry remembered meeting Wortmann decades later. When Wortmann explained that fuel had run out, Anderson admitted, "We never knew you were that short. We had so much we never thought about it." That simple exchange captured the entire war in miniature. One side drowning in abundance, the other gasping on scarcity. The Ardennes offensive had cost Germany more than 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. But its greatest cost was invisible, the destruction of illusions. Every German soldier who saw Americans burn millions of gallons realized that the Reich's defeat was not a matter of courage or tactics, but of industrial arithmetic. By January 1945, the last fires of the Ardennes offensive smoldered out. Snow covered the wrecks of tanks left at La Glaise, Stummel, and along the narrow Belgian roads. Villagers picked through the frozen hulks, finding helmets, maps, and jerry cans, mute witnesses to the Reich's last gamble. For historians, one image has endured: a Tiger tank still standing in La Glaise today, abandoned not because of enemy fire, but because its tank was dry. Tourists often ask guides why such a formidable machine was left behind. The answer is brutally simple: no fuel. That two-word explanation carried the weight of the entire campaign. It was the story of Germany in 1944, a nation that had once unleashed blitzkrieg across Europe, now measured progress in liters and meters. A Reich that had terrified continents, now rationed its dreams by drops of gasoline. The Americans, by contrast, measured in oceans. In 1944 alone, the United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil. Germany managed just 33 million. America built 324,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, and more trucks than Germany could ever fuel. The Red Ball Express consumed more gasoline in 1 month than the Wehrmacht delivered to all fronts in the same period. This was not simply a difference of numbers. It was a difference of worlds. One side fought an industrial war with limitless resources, pipelines under oceans, convoys stretching beyond the horizon, aircraft fueled without hesitation. The other fought with dwindling reserves, collapsing plants, and soldiers who prayed for captured cans. The Ardennes revealed that truth in the starkest way. At Hansfeld, Germans discovered 50,000 gallons abandoned by retreating Americans, a treasure that seemed miraculous. Yet only a day later, at Stavelot, they saw Americans torch more than 2 million gallons without hesitation. Across the Ardennes, over 8 million gallons were deliberately destroyed in a week, more than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. The miracle of Hansfeld was not salvation, it was revelation. Piper's own words, spoken years later, captured the essence. Finding that depot was the worst thing. It showed us we were finished. They had oceans, we had drops. We discovered impossibility. Albert Speer, reflecting after the war, admitted the same. The war was decided not by generals, but by refineries. Our synthetic fuel plants could not withstand Allied bombing. Once they were destroyed, the war was only a matter of time. For ordinary German soldiers, the lesson was burned into memory. They had seen Americans idle engines through the night for warmth, trucks left half-loaded, rations discarded, Convoys endless. They had fought for every liter, only to discover that their enemy wasted more than they possessed. One Gefreiter wrote bitterly to his family, "We do not fight men anymore. We fight numbers. We fight infinity." The Battle of the Bulge consumed 100,000 German casualties, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. But the greater casualty was belief. The myth of German superiority collapsed not under artillery, but under the sight of oceans of fuel wasted, burned, and denied. The war had always been one of production, but in the Ardennes, every soldier saw it with his own eyes. Empty tanks in the snow told the truth more clearly than any speech. Industrial war was won not by daring thrusts, but by the side that could keep engines turning. And so, at La Glaise, the final image remained. A Tiger tank, its gun still aimed, its armor unbroken, its crew long gone. The most powerful machine of its time, rendered useless not by enemy fire, but by an empty gauge. That Tiger, frozen in place, stands as a monument to the true weapon that won the war: oil.